David, welcome. Shall we start by you're telling us how you started with the prototype carbon fund and later with the carbon finance unit?
Yes, indeed. So thanks for inviting me. Great pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I was recruited in '96 into the legal office as then was the legal advisor environment and international law, and it subsequently became the environmental and socially sustainable development and international law group. A bit of a mouthful, but so our client at that point was the bank, but also the GF, right? So we were the GF kind of focal point in the legal office. So when the idea for the new products, I think was as part of the strategic compact of Jim Wolfenson's strategic compact, was '97. The approach was made to us to actually take the lead on the legal aspects of that, working with Ken Newcomb and in the early days, and he was at that point the coordinator of the Global Environment Facility. So initially we were thinking of it as a model rather like the GF. It would be grant-based financing. And then it came a long way from that, as you've probably already discussed. Yeah. I mean, so when we first started to look at it, we had a number of countries who were interested in supporting us. I mean, there were the Netherlands, I seem to remember, the Scandinavian countries, particularly Norway and Sweden, Switzerland, and then the Japanese bank as well was interesting, International Cooperation Bank. So we had a number of advisory meetings at that point. At that point, Kyoto was still, so this would be '96, right? So it was, Kyoto was still being, there was a gleam in the eye, right? So we hadn't even worked out what would happen. I remember having an advisory group meeting in this building, and one of the problems of the text of the Kyoto, what became the Kyoto Protocol at that point, was it didn't envisage private sector being involved. And so I remember the Dutch delegation turning to me to say, so give us some text. So I had to go off at lunchtime and come back with some suggested text for the actual text of Article 6, that was then on joint implementation for the Kyoto Protocol, which the Swiss then introduced. It changed a little bit. We were talking about intermediaries, whereas they actually said private sector and under the authority of one of the state parties. So that kind of, from us, if you like, that the private sector issue really came, was clearly made, it was clarified in the text of the Kyoto Protocol itself. I actually fell out with the General Counsel over that, who told me this was not proper public international law, but it worked.
That was Mr. Shihata?
Yes, the redoubtable Mr. Shihata. I said, well, I'll write you a legal opinion, which he kind of marked up, rather like a schoolboy essay. And then I published it in his Festschrift. They did a book of essays in his memory, and he was wry enough to realize I was taking the mickey.
So in terms of the early challenges in establishing something this novel inside the institution, what were the challenges? Who were the champions? What was the process?
Yeah, it was a very interesting one. So Ken himself was then the GF Supremo in the bank. So we very much saw it as being a fund which would collect money, like the GF could collect money, and then we'd actually give it as grants to projects. But it became clear pretty soon, once we started to interact with more governments and also with some of the private sector. We invited some of the leading law firms in London and New York to come and talk to us, particularly London. And it was clear that this was going to be, if the private sector were going to be involved, it couldn't be talking about grants. It had to be contract-based. And this was, so my group, which was fairly small at that point, 5 or 6 of us, we had no experience of doing private sector work, right? We were kind of the public sector environmental law people. So we knew grants, but we weren't actually familiar with that. So that was one of the things that, for us as a legal group, that was a big challenge. We had a new general counsel then, and he had just come in from the private sector, so he actually suggested somebody from his old law firm who actually made some advice, gave us some advice, and we developed what became the emission reductions purchase agreement. That was the very first one, and we're still using that terminology and that kind of still. So that would have been '97. That was just after the. It would be beginning of '98. So Kyoto was the end of December of '97. So it was the beginning of '98. The other issue which we never even thought about was, of course, that inviting the private sector, and you remember that the strategy of the Prototype Carbon Fund was to invite a number of governments, but also private sector companies. So the governments had to put 10 million and the private sector had to put 5 million in. And we weren't invited them, and it was kind of environmental risk capital. So the idea was that they would be prepared to, they didn't want to lose it, but they were prepared to take more risks than perhaps a normal private sector. And at that point we weren't really sure, and we're still not really sure, what the legal status of these emission reductions units is. And so our finance unit, the guys who do all the money raising within the bank, said this could be a commodity. You know, so you're running into problems with the Securities and Exchange Commission if you're offering commodities. And so we had to, that put us under a lot of constraint, which I knew the carbon finance team found very frustrating, because we weren't allowed to make it as a public offering. So we had to be careful about the publicity that we gave it. So we did it as a private offering, which meant we couldn't do a public prospectus. It couldn't, the information about it had to be limited. And I know that was, Ken and his team got very frustrated with that, as did I, but I mean, we were told this was a serious risk if the Securities Commission took action. So.
Yeah, I remember we had to report on everybody who was at a workshop where, and they were sophisticated investors, and it did place a huge amount of constraint on the way our presentations needed to be structured and so on. But it was a unique learning experience for us as well.
Yeah, it meant that most of the solicitation had to be done on a one-to-one basis. So that meant that Ken and I and you and others I know did a lot of travelling. Yeah. I remember going out with Ken on a European trip. We went to Japan twice, I remember, but the European trip, I mean, was like 5 countries in 2 days, for which we came back with about $30 million, so it was worth it. Yeah. Luxembourg at that point thought it was a little bit too much for it in terms of it, but I think at that point we came back with Sweden, certainly. We went to Denmark, which wasn't successful, but the Netherlands and Norway were all eventually members as well. So, yeah, it was good.
In terms of the external partners, and certainly you've named the countries, in terms of the private sector, where was most of the interest?
Well, it was the power companies, those that had actually seen the light, really. I mean, BP was one of the big movers, that they just decided to have an internal carbon neutral policy, so their main interlocutor was BP, and the fact that BP was interested meant that some of the big oil companies, so Statoil in Norway was interested, and then one of the French electricity companies joined. Some of the others, a couple of banks were interested to start with, and they joined later. I think Rabobank joined in the second, we had a second closing. But initially, because we were feeling our way as to who would actually be there. And what was the trip to Japan was particularly interesting, because most of the main interlocutor was Tokyo Electric, TEPCO. And there was sort of a number of other people at the meeting. And once they decided to go in, I think it took 2 trips to actually persuade them. Once they decided, then all the other companies came as well. We just had a succession of people banging on our door, and so we had collected about $60 million in that one trip because of the other. And so the initial closing, I think, was 145. The board was quite interested. You know, the bank's board was followed this quite closely. Not all of them were supportive. Some of them. Oil-producing countries were a little sceptical, but generally very supportive. And then we decided to have a second closing, which took us up to, I think, in the order of 160. And then we actually allowed the existing investors, we weren't allowed to call them investors, actually participants. That was one of the issues of the Securities Exchange. So one of that was trying to get everybody out of this sort of jargon was part of the problem. Take it up to 180. So we had 180 by the end of 1999, which was a fair sum.
At a time where Kyoto Protocol still had to enter into force, it was just about a year old, if I remember correctly. This is 1999. So that was quite an achievement.
And we didn't even know whether the early investments would actually, I can't use that word, whether the early investments would actually be able to generate credit. So it was a big risk for them, and quite substantial. $5 million, quite substantial.
Yeah, because Marrakesh was still a while away. So the equivalent of the Paris rule book for Kyoto Protocol was Marrakesh Accord. And that was still a while away. And a lot of the initial ones, initial projects were in that uncertainty, right?
Yeah, I think we'll actually probably like to be in the same position with the Hague meeting, with the Poland meeting, the Katowice meeting, as we were with Hague in 2000, right? That it was actually probably not going to be concluded. So then there's more uncertainty. Can we start investments already? So we did actually, the portfolio actually started quite earlier than that.
In terms of the partners inside the institution, where did we find allies? Where did we find people who were not very supportive within the World Bank?
Right. I think the developing countries particularly were interested, and we had, in addition to the meetings with the countries that were potential investors, we had 3 or 4 meetings with the host countries. I remember going to a meeting in India with you, and we also had one in Switzerland, I think, and another one in Porvoo in Finland. So, and that was mostly with the host countries. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, a little bit of suspicion amongst some of the group of 77 within the UN as well. The World Bank was trying to capture this, right? That they were actually trying to dictate what the terms would be, and was not in our mind, and I mean certainly not in Ken's mind, I know, and others. So that was a bit of a PR job for us to do that. One of the things we didn't know, for example, was what the service charge would be. Remember, there was going to be a
share of proceeds.
A share of proceeds, right? So what would that be? And I remember having a meeting with the small AOSIS, the small island countries, and they said, well, you should set it at 10%. And we thought, this is a tad too high, right? It ends up at 1%, right? So I think our feelings were probably right on that. But there were certain things that we were able to, the fact that we were talking to them about this, I think allayed some of their fears. And it certainly wasn't the intent to try and capture this in any way. And the capping the fund at under 200 million, I think made it clear that even at that point, the sort of money that we needed to be mobilized was being talked about. We commissioned a paper, I remember, from MIT suggesting that in order to meet the Kyoto targets, $30 billion needed to be mobilized. Now we're talking about a year. We're talking about 100 billion now. So that was 20 years ago. So most of those 200 million against that background is fairly small, but it did attract a lot of attention, and I think it actually helped with the Marrakesh process, because many of the parties negotiating had been involved with us. Canada was another country, of course, that's been involved with that.
And in terms of the management within the World Bank, were there areas or people who supported this and facilitated the whole process, or was it largely one champion taking it through?
Well, I mean, so Ken was the head of the group, right? But he had the support of his vice president and the management team. The GF was a little suspicious as to whether we were trying to do a kind of internal capture, and so we had to. I think I was at the meeting where we sat down and actually worked out, a modus vivendi. We'd actually say so. It's not trying to poach the Global Environment Facility portfolio. It's a whole new area of business, and we had decided that it was decided at that meeting that we wouldn't have GF and what then became the Prototype Fund investments in the same project. So that was probably not altogether a good, optimal, but was actually a fine working relationship. And getting the first projects off the ground was a bit of a problem anyway. You'll remember some of the first ones in Latvia and some of the others, and because we had to get the task managers up to speed. So I don't remember, I mean, there was suspicion amongst some of our shareholders, but on the board, but I don't remember any opposition from it. My colleagues in legal office sort of raised eyebrows, something new, fairly new. And of course, the finance unit, which subsequently, it was the Tom Duval's group who actually eventually helped us so much. Eventually, they took over, most of that business. But my group is by then getting up to like 16, 17 people, and it's not core business. Once you get onto things like mezzanine financing, this is not an international environmental law issue, right? So that sort of worked out quite amicably, I think.
So, in terms of the work itself and the evolution, you talked a little bit about, the issues with setting up the fund, the private placement.
Right.
In terms of doing the legal work around the emission reduction purchase agreement, because as you remember, the Latvia project was a financing agreement, right? Where we were co-financiers, and then we changed our mind and moved it towards result-based finance, what later became known as result-based finance, which we'll talk about a little more. But do you remember the evolution, how it evolved, and how you got to eventually the general conditions of the ERPA?
Well, we start off, as I said, the original model was that it would be like the GF, Global Environment Facility, that would be a grant agreement. And so the task manager was quite comfortable working with that. So we actually did a grant agreement, and I think it was during the course of the discussions of that Ken had this trip to Jerusalem moment, where he said, this is not the way we should do this. And this was largely because I'm seeming to remember that it was after we'd had a couple of our consultative meetings. We actually had a legal group meeting as well, where we invited people from law firms in Washington and from New York and from London, from Paris. Quite a small group, but actually quite an interesting discussion. And they were saying, we can't do grants, right? This is not something that we know about or would want to do if we're going to think about the private sector. And then Ken, I think, who'd already been thinking about this, said, well, yeah, we should. This is an opportunity for the bank to lead. We use this phrase, which others have used, I'm sure, lead from behind, right? We didn't want to be too pushy, but this kind of model of what we were trying to do should be something that the private sector could emulate, public sector and private sector. And so we had, task manager, I remember not being very pleased. We had to then completely turn this around. And then we had to, we'd already done the things that the Kyoto Protocol required. So we already had the host state had already agreed to this project, the transfer of emission reductions. We already had the participants, the countries who were going to buy the emission reductions, they'd already signed agreements with us. So we had that infrastructure. It was just the modality. And then I remember pushing back a bit on the idea of a private sector agreement, because it's not something I have any experience with, right? So I asked for some help with one of the senior management meetings in the legal department, legal vice presidency, and nobody stepped forward to help. So it's Ko Young Tung was he'd only been there about 6 months, and he said, well, maybe I can find somebody who will be able to help you. And again, it was totally new. I can't remember the name of the guy who actually was extremely good, who actually helped us. But we actually, Hanneke van Tilburg and I, basically kind of beat this out. She did a lot of the work on that, and he then came back and had a very strong kind of private sector view of it, and he was worried about the risks. Of course, that was the big issue with it. So that was and then I asked my colleagues to review it, and they actually gave some very useful. And Tom Duval was one of the people who was became very involved in it. And as the time went by, these agreements became more and more sophisticated. And beyond my competence or interest, to be frank. I mean, I'm an international lawyer, not a private sector finance lawyer, right? So that was where Tom's group became much more involved, and the specialization became more, and that's really the way that how it's evolved into the private sector, right? That it's the private sector, it's the finance groups who are involved. So I think Ken's instincts in going for the banks and the big power companies who were going to be doing this had worked out to be right.
And in terms of building a team, as you said, you started off with a small team, which later became quite sophisticated and well known internationally for leading on this discussion. How did that come about? Where did you find the people?
Well, that was interesting. So we actually had a lot of the countries that were interested in volunteered people to help us. So, for example, I mentioned Hanneke. She was actually seconded by the Dutch ministry. we were mentioning Charlotte Streck, who I hope you'll be interviewing too as well. So she joined my group. She had been suggested by the German ministry. We had a Japanese colleague as well. So basically the countries that were interested were putting support and money on the table, which is a fairly common approach within the bank. Largely because there wasn't resources, there weren't resources within legal to do that. Eventually, the finance that was generated by the funds were actually allowed them to pay for them. We had an Australian, you remember a couple of others, so it actually became quite a large group. But it was so that it was mostly self-generating as a result of the financing from this, which is good sustainable approach.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you've talked a little bit about the evolution of the business within the legal department from an international environmental law to mostly co-financing kind of arrangement. How do you see this in the context of the shift in the business over the last 20 years? Where is the challenge now from a legal framework as far as the titles to emission reductions, the policies related to emission reductions are concerned?
Well, I've been retired for 10 years, right? I still teach international climate change law at George Washington University, so I've kept up with the developments in the international regime rather than with what's been going on at the bank. I know there have been a lot of reorganizations. But basically, I mean, the actual business of the legal business of the arrangements for all these now huge amounts, more than $2.5 billion of funding that you have, that's pretty mature. I mean, that's all been done for a long time. The big issue at the time, which is interesting, we may come back to that, but that's the issue of pricing of these units, right? If we want to discuss that now, but we maybe come back to that. But so that's a pretty mature business. I think as you go forward, you've got the same sort of challenges now with the Paris Agreement that we had with Kyoto. That that the actual wording of it's Article 6 again. Interestingly, of the Paris Agreement, it's just it was Article 6 and Article 12 of Kyoto that actually seem to be clear-ish, but there's an awful lot of bones to be done, and a lot of whether some of these issues will be compulsory, whether they'll be mandatory, whether you will have to do them or may, some of the guidelines, and that's been a basic problem within the Framework Convention regime itself, and within Paris, the whole structure is that the commitments, the nationally determined contributions, are not legally binding, but everything else is. So that's going to be a big debate, which is already a big debate within the Paris Rule Group, the working group, I know. So that's going to be the same issue for you, and I'm sure you've taken that aboard and are looking at that, and the same sort of modalities. So that the lawyers are going to have to rethink this at some point. One of the issues, it seems to me, is that you've got to bring forward the agreements which you already have on the Kyoto, which were done under the Kyoto framework, and you want those to be incorporated, but it's a slightly different structure under Article 6. So the challenge of doing that and updating those agreements is going to be quite interesting. It'll be interesting times again.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the issues that we're encountering more and more is the idea of CDM transition. The projects, CDM projects, how will they transition into Article 6 transactions, particularly in the context of the consideration of the NDC.
Right.
So it is, as you say, a very interesting time, and it will be good to offline get your inputs into that. You brought up the interesting issue of pricing, which we haven't discussed till now too much in the previous discussions. From your recollection, where was the challenge?
Well, this was, I mean, the big issue that the World Bank board was interested in was institutional risk, right? So we're going ahead of everybody else. We don't want to be seen to be pushing the Framework Convention process. This is the leading from behind. So once you get onto the issues of buying emission reductions, how do you set the price? A lot of experts were advising that there would be a huge rise in the price of, as there should be, right? I think you and I would probably agree, right? There should be a big rise in that. But we're using money which we've gathered from other people, so we're trustees of this money. So we can't. It wasn't the position of the bank to be saying, you have to pay more for this than the market demands. On the other hand, we're also a development organisation, so we want the developing countries to actually get the substantial benefits of this. So we didn't want to push the price down for the benefit of the. So we were really between a rock and a hard place on this, and there was a lot of discussions within the participants group on this. Noticeably, the private sector wanted the prices to be low, unexpectedly, whereas the public sector were less pushy about that, but acted as something of a counterfoil. So we ended up with a series of we tried a series. I seem to remember we were thinking in terms of prices of about $5 a ton at that point. But with the possibility of increasing in line with market prices. I think the first year that I taught my course at GW, at George Washington University, I actually said to the class, they've all got their laptops open, I said, so tell me what the price per tonne of this was 2009, tonne of carbon, less than $3 a tonne. So the prices had just collapsed, largely as a result of the 2008 financial crisis and the surge in prices of. At one point, I remember the European emission system, the trading system, price went up to nearly $30 a tonne, and I'm looking at this thinking, we did, the participants in this fund got a really good deal, right? They're buying them at $5 plus. Rates which were sort of like an incremental rate, and then of course it completely collapsed. So I know that's one of the, talking to colleagues who are still working on it, that's one of the been one of the issues. I've had to renegotiate a couple of those as well. So but I mean, I would hope that once we get on a standard, once we know what the rules are, the Paris rule book's finished, the price of carbon dioxide would start to go up. We talk about carbon, right? We talked about carbon dioxide. Yeah. If you remember that, looking back at the high-level committee that was appointed by the Secretary General after Copenhagen, they talked in terms of prices, a realistic price of at least $20 a tonne, and that's really what the price should be if we're going to meet the sort of targets reductions that Paris is envisaging, right? Yeah. So that's going to be a challenge for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And quite frankly, if you look at the financial analysis that has to be done at the project level, anything below 5 or 7 or 8, it's difficult to talk about the additionality of the emission reduction, because you can't see the impact.
20 years worth of inflation.
Yeah,
of course,
of course. That is true as well. And
yes, right, exactly.
If you have a price of about 20, you would begin to see the needle move on the impact of a price of carbon.
Right.
At 30, I think in energy sector, you would have changes in fundamental decision on what you would do. Right. In the transport, it needs to go up to 60, 70, 80. But really? In the energy sector, at $30, you would transform the choice. So pricing was, as I remember as well, a big issue, particularly as we were representing the buyers because of the trust fund nature. There was a lot of discussion in the team as well, in addition to the legal quandary that we were under. As to whether we represented the buyer or the seller. The buyer was often more sophisticated and better informed, and we didn't know how to inform our clients, the host countries, on how to negotiate prices. Legal department helped us a lot in putting together this kind of workshops to inform them and so on.
Well, I remember having, just on that whole point, we'll come back to the wider issue, but actually we had a workshop in Africa, which two of my guys went to along with you. We did a fantastic training operation, which was really like nearly 2 weeks. And then when the team came to negotiate the agreement, none of the people who'd been at the training were actually there. So when we had actually appointed a guardian ad litem, we'd actually appointed a counsel to help them, and they had no understanding of the issues. So we just recessed and had a day where we actually did a training I had to sort of separate the people who were going to do the negotiations from my side with those who were doing the training, but to get this other team up to. So it's I mean, just as it was a big learning curve for us, for the host countries, it also was as well. So that's, that was a big issue.
And I think it continues to be the lack of balance between the selling countries and the buying countries, so to speak, is the biggest problem even now. The lack of understanding of what the meaning of NDC is. So I think that will remain to be a big challenge in terms of going forward.
If you look at the NDCs, I mean, they're quite impressive, but many of them cover things which are not about commitments. I mean, a colleague did I'm interested in ocean issues, and a colleague did a review of the number of projects, a number of NDCs which actually mentioned oceans. It's not intuitive that any of them would, but quite a number did. 30 or 40 countries actually mentioned sort of ocean carbon and things like that, which, again, that's a challenge if you're going to think there's any mention of that in the Paris Agreement. Just back to the issue of price there. I mean, one of the ways we tried to get round was choosing projects with methane instead of emissions. So that, what I remember Ken used to call the methane kick because of the higher, what is it?
Global warming potential.
Yeah, but it's used to be 20, now it's 21. It's gone up, right? So that meant that the price per ton was much higher, so we could actually get a better return for host countries and also for the contributors as well as the participants in the fund. So that was quite an important way of increasing the issue. That once you get onto some of the other even more powerful you run into political issues, right? Which we don't. That was after my time.
Yes, the HFC story was a part of that. The 11,000 times the global warming potential of CO2, and the windfall profit. I think that did a lot of damage because we didn't tell our story in a correct context. Can we now turn to what you think the key lessons were of the bank setting up the prototype carbon fund, and then more broadly the country funds and the carbon finance business over the last 10-15 years?
Well, I haven't followed the bank that closely over the last 10 years, but certainly the incentive for this was this new products initiative, which was Wolfenson's, which was a lot of very interesting things came out of that. So that, there is an incentive to give this very highly motivated, very smart staff in the bank, the idea is seed money to start things of that kind. I think the advantage of the bank being involved was that in the early transactions, which others followed, then the interests of the host countries were very much to the fore, largely because our shareholders are looking over our shoulders, right? And so is our management. So it would have been much easier to have been much more hard-nosed as a buyer than we would otherwise. And certainly I know that most of the colleagues who were involved in this were interested in development rather than carbon finance was a way of actually as a new. I wrote a paper on this calling New Sources of Financing for Sustainable Development, because it was remember Article 6 talked about sustainable development and contributing to emission reductions. So sustainable development was one of the key agendas, and I think that was very much in the mind of the team at the whole time, and I think Ken deserves credit for that as well. And some of the other funds that he set up after the PCF were involved in trying to do things which were like a social issues and the more difficult parts of it. So I think the bank played a very key role in getting this going. It's a shame, I mean, in retrospect, recessions are not kind of good for anyone, but it did really set that process back. And I suppose a recession reduces the amount of emissions of carbon dioxide, but it also set back this process whereby we could address it in a more sustainable way. So I think the challenges of meeting Paris, the Paris rule book requirements, very similar to the ones that we had when we were looking at the Marrakesh, implementing Marrakesh. That was a very stressful time. I remember after Marrakesh Accords came out, which are like 120 pages. We had to really seriously go through them. We'd been following it as it went, but a lot of it was decided at the last minute. So we had to sort of adapt our processes to take that into account, which was presumably what you've already got under control. So I think that some lessons are that the bank does have a really important role to play in educating its host countries as to the way in which the host countries to its own members, as the way the opportunities this presents. And I have to say that reading through Article 6, I still haven't really got my mind around some of the possibilities. It even seems to suggest it's not just mitigation but also adaptation, which is a whole new ball game, right? So, and that, if that can be done, that's really an important source of new financing, given the needs that the big needs that are going to be to meet some of these targets, to try and help developing countries to actually be more ambitious in their nationally determined contributions, which just had the report of the IPCC on 1.5, on the implications of a 1.5 degree centigrade increase, which are horrific. So, not to mention what it'll be really on. We're on a path for two at least, right? And we're not even on a pathway to stop at 2. So I think that's a bit of a wake-up call. So that's a role for the bank, I think. We were talking earlier about mainstreaming some of this in banks lending. I mean, that's always been one of the tensions, was at the time that we were actually doing this, and perhaps I should have mentioned that before, the Energy Department was trying to lend money for coal. And saying, the developed countries don't have obligations to reduce their emissions. This is the cheapest form of fuel. It's our interest to. I remember there was a big loan to South Africa, which was very controversial. But then, a year later, there's a one of the biggest renewables projects launched in South Africa, which with Elcom, isn't it? Eskom, the South African utility. So now, if you like, there's a big foothold in Africa for renewables, and the other African countries look to South Africa for leadership on these things. So there's a big challenge, but also a tremendous opportunity, I think. So, so just pulling that together, the lessons of the Kyoto experience and the Prototype Carbon Fund is that we certainly had made a role in forming the way in which it works. I think as effectively, and certainly the bank has a role there, I think, going forward as well. As an even-handed role, not just about those who are looking for returns, but those who are actually going to get the inward investments. When you start talking about sector-wide projects rather than, not even projects actually, this is sector-wide transformations programs,
And in terms of missed opportunities or things that the World Bank could have done better, which have a lesson for how we think of the future. I mean, does anything specific come to mind?
No, we probably, no, I don't know. I mean, I thought about this. It was a learning by doing, the whole thing, right? So we made a few mistakes. I mean, starting off as grants was obviously not going to work, right? But it's the mindset that we had of what you do with a trust fund. But we remedied that pretty well, and I think more than adequately compensated for that with the way we've worked since. I think it's important that it be part of the mainstream of bank work rather than a niche industry. And we start off as a niche industry, right? Not in opposition to the Energy Department, but sort of like at the same time, energy trying to do something differently. So whereas climate change has always been one of the bank's important agendas, and I see now under the current leadership that is absolutely the one of its main agendas, which it should be. This business should be, part and parcel, if you like, of country programming rather than a niche industry, which it became. But that's not really something that was done wrong. It was just a nascent industry that grows and business that grows and develops, I think.
And so in addition to the idea that the programs need to be mainstreamed into World Bank lending, are there any specific suggestions you would have for the bank to engage in the next generation of carbon markets?
Well, we don't know what it's going to look like, right? But
Yeah.
it's certainly clear that some of these nationally determined contribution programs are going to be huge, right? So it's quite difficult to say that without looking at them until we see the rule book, right? What is it actually? What are we going to be allowed to do? What are you not going to be allowed to do? Obviously, I think the Kyoto mechanisms need to be drawn, but will need to be part of it. So presumably, some of the modalities of the clean development mechanism, I can't see JI working that same with it, but that's just, I may be wrong with that. But certainly the clean development mechanism modalities will need to be incorporated so that some of the ongoing projects that you've got, which are still generating emission reductions, should continue. We don't want them to stop. So those need to be incorporated. But it's but rather than being, if you like, the cream on the cake, it needs to be the cake itself, right?
Yeah.
We need to be actually really helping to change, helping governments to implement changes in the way in which they generate energy, the transport sector, etc.
And now in concluding, are there any other key issues that we've missed out on talking, or that you think would be important as we move forward?
I think we've covered them all pretty well. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks, David.
All right.
Thanks.
All right, indeed, good questions. Thanks. That was fun.